Human beings tend to find comfort in certainty, which is what drives us to draw conclusions and make predictions about the future. But our conclusions are often incorrect and our predictions often wrong. So, how can science help us make them better? Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Luke, and this is the Science Lens, where I show you how science can improve your critical thinking skills. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about inductive reasoning. There's a belief held by a lot of parents that sugar makes kids hyperactive. And it makes sense on the face of it because, you'll see kids at a birthday party eating a bunch of cake and drinking soda. So people assume that it's all of that sugar causing them to run around like loonies. But according to a meta-analysis in the Journal of the American Medical Association, sugar has no effect on the behavior of kids. And the reason they get all hyped up at birthday parties is just because they're having fun with their friends. So this is an example of when our intuitive conclusions are contradicted by a scientific study, and it happens more often than we might like to think. So why is it that our conclusions can be so wrong? Well, it has a lot to do with something called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is a thinking process that involves taking a set of observations, recognizing a pattern, and then drawing conclusions. So, for example, if you had a bag full of coins and you pulled out 10 of them and found that they were all 5-cent pieces, you'd conclude that all of the coins in the bag were 5-cent pieces. In the example with kids at birthday parties, parents would notice that their kids were hyperactive, recognize the pattern that had always seemed to happen when they ate sugar, and conclude that eating sugar causes hyperactivity. We also use inductive reasoning for making predictions about the future. So, for example, if you notice that your stock portfolio has grown by an average of 8% for the last 10 years, you might predict that it'll grow by 8% next year as well. Inductive reasoning is a necessary and powerful way of thinking because recognizing patterns and using them to form understandings about the world is one of the reasons that humans became so successful as a species. But when it's not used carefully, it can easily go wrong. So what are some of the ways that inductive reasoning can go wrong, and what can science teach us about drawing better conclusions? Well, one way that inductive reasoning can go wrong is if you have a small set of observations, or as a scientist would put it, if you have a small sample size. To go back to the coins example, if you only pulled 3 5-cent pieces from the bag, you'd never feel confident saying that all of the coins in the bag were 5-cent pieces. This is why one of the key elements of a good experiment is to have a large sample size. The bigger the better, because the more samples you have, the more confident you can be in your conclusions. There could be some variable that you hadn't considered that's influencing your results. In this case, using a thinking routine like Edward de Bono's Consider All Factors can be helpful. Consider All Factors is a way to think about a situation from multiple perspectives, and it can help sort of slow you down to consider whether you're focusing too much on just one possible conclusion. But there can also be variables that you aren't aware of and couldn't possibly predict, so the so-called unknown unknowns. Now, unfortunately, there's just no way to avoid these, so your only option is to acknowledge that any conclusions you make through inductive reasoning will come with some level of uncertainty. The third way inductive reasoning can go wrong is if your observations aren't typical for the things that you're observing. This is what scientists call sampling bias. For example, the parents seeing their kids at birthday parties weren't thinking about all the other times that their kids eat sugar, like eating lollies at the movies or eating cereal at breakfast. So birthday parties aren't typical of all the times that kids eat sugar. To help with this problem, you just have to find a way to make sure your observations are what we call a representative sample. Finally, biases can not only affect our observations, but our logic as well. So for example, parents of children at parties probably already had the belief that eating sugar made their kids hyperactive, so it's likely that confirmation bias contributed to their conclusion. The best general advice I can give for overcoming biases is to learn about as many as you can. If you can understand the ways that our brains can lead us astray, you'll be able to recognize when it's happening to you. I have a range of videos on that topic, so for more information, I recommend that you check those out. Now, all of these suggestions can help you draw better conclusions, but to be honest, none of them can get you closer to the truth than my last suggestion, which is to do an experiment. But doing experiments is so important that it needs a whole video all to itself, so stay tuned in the coming weeks for that one. Before I continue, I just have a small request that if you're enjoying the video so far, please click the like button and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like it. Okay, continuing on. So let's practice our new critical thinking skills with another example. About 10 years ago, I took a trip to Sydney, and it was a quick flight from Melbourne. That's where I was living at the time, so I only went for the weekend, but it was long enough for me to go out to 2 restaurants. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have a great time at those restaurants. The food was kind of meh, and the service wasn't very friendly. So I came to the conclusion that restaurants in Sydney weren't as good as they are in Melbourne. Where did my inductive reasoning go wrong? Well, first off, I only had a sample size of 2, which is not nearly large enough in a city of almost 20,000 restaurants. There may have been variables that I hadn't considered, like maybe the chef had to call in sick that day, or maybe the waiter didn't sleep very well. The 2 restaurants I visited were right in the touristy areas of the city, so not really a representative sample. And finally, you might not know this, but there's a rivalry between Melbourne and Sydney, so I'm predisposed to think that everything from Sydney stinks. And I have to admit that bias may have colored my impression of the restaurants. So I started with an incomplete set of observations, then let my biases influence my logic to reach an incorrect conclusion, when really the fair thing to do would have just been to withhold judgment until I had more data. Now, this may not be a big problem if all we're talking about is my opinion of restaurants in Sydney, but rushing to conclusions can be a big problem when more important things are concerned. Because that kind of poor reasoning could lead to everything from bad investments or stereotyping people or making the wrong decision for your health. Now, unfortunately, no matter how hard we try, we can never gain 100% certainty with inductive reasoning. But if we avoid bad logic and understand what makes a good set of data, we can make better conclusions and predictions. And if you ever travel to Sydney, maybe you can avoid my mistake of being too quick to pass judgment. Even though Sydney stinks, Melbourne rules. What are some conclusions and predictions that you know about that were shown to be incorrect? I'd love to hear about them in the comments below, or you can get in touch with me via my website, thesciencelens.com, where I also have a bunch of resources for teaching critical thinking in the science classroom and a page where I list the services that I can offer. Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this one. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Ian Edwards and Byron Farrow, who helped me out with some background information for today's video. And I also used a range of other resources that I've linked down below that you should check out if you'd like more information. And finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to my lovely wife, Jen, who contributes so much to all of my videos, but was particularly helpful and patient with this one. Seriously, it was a real grind. That wraps it up. Thanks for watching.